reports from credible individuals suggest that something shocking may be stalking the woods of the southern United States. Something massive, bipedal, and covered in hair. Hi, I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and this is Just Energy. Just Energy is brought to you by SoulHealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer. Today, we are joined by acclaimed author, cryptid researcher, and good friend, Lyle Blackburn, as he traverses woods and waterways, delves into dusty archives, and discusses a host of credible eyewitness testimony as he searches for one of the South's most enduring mysteries, the Southern Sasquatch. So please welcome Lyle Blackburn. Hey Lyle, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
I'm great. I love this new video format because I can wave at you and it's kind of like hanging out, which is always fun. And I'm so excited that you have, a new book out. So I get to have you back on and visit with you. And this one again is about Bigfoot. I think your favorite topic to talk about. And so, we've introduced you in the past on the show, so if people want to get to know, your history and your background, a bit of the bio that I provided, they need to go listen to the other archive shows. So we're just going to kind of dig right in. And, but it seems like the number of Bigfoot sightings are increasing, and I thought Bigfoot was pretty much located in the Pacific Northwest. So how far and wide do you think the range of Bigfoot is?
Well, it's really surprising when you look at a map or start looking into the history of these sightings, because it's really all over the U.S. I mean, there's certain areas that have more than others, and obviously those tend to correspond with the more heavily wooded areas, the mountainous areas, swampy areas, things like that. But yeah, I mean, early on, back when I was a kid, my perception of Bigfoot was just that it was something that existed in the Pacific Northwest. And, that was mostly all there was to it until I saw the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek, which came out in the 70s and kind of dramatized sightings of a Sasquatch-like creature in southern Arkansas. But unbeknownst to me at the time, there were other sightings that had been documented in newspapers and even books and things like that, just things that I hadn't read yet as a small kid. But, it is something that's existed in the history of all kinds of small towns out there, and specifically, in the eastern portions, southeast and southern areas, and then, of course, predominantly in the Pacific Northwest. But there's a huge number of sightings everywhere, really.
But I think that's kind of interesting. But let's talk a little history first. Because you mentioned newspapers, and so let's start there and maybe go back in time. In your research, how far back do you find these sightings recorded in the newspaper?
Well, I mean, they start back in the 1800s, in which you have a lot of sightings of what they call, quote unquote, wild men. Now, we kind of look at those now and interpret them as possible Bigfoot incidents, but they didn't use the term Bigfoot, and often, would just simply leave it at wild man. So there is some leap of assumptions and things like that when you look at those historical newspapers. And those newspapers, of course, sometimes were factual, sometimes not, who knows. But, there are a number of those that existed in the 1800s. So you think, there could be something to that. And obviously, if Bigfoot creatures do exist, then they would have had to exist at the time, and people would have seen them. So the best you can do is kind of document those for what it's worth. Now, of course, when you get to the 1900s, especially starting in around the 1930s and 40s, you do have a lot of what are very much described as Bigfoot-like creatures on record. And, again, providing a sort of a historical record that they could have been here all along, and would have been if they do exist. So there's plenty of newspaper reports, and of course, in my books and in my research, I've just collected as many of those as I can to build up my files, and then of course use that as the historical basis in my books.
When you were talking about the wild man kind of guy, did they give a description? Did they talk about like this hairy man wandering around in the woods? Or could it have been, when I heard the word wild man, I always thought of like some kind of a trapper, that kind of was like out in the woods and went a little crazy kind of guy. But that was just, I wasn't into Bigfoot, I guess, at the time, or didn't even, even make a correlation that it could possibly be a Bigfoot that they're describing. But did they ever give any kind of description of what they were seeing?
They do, and typically, with the exception of a few cases, they do describe creatures that seem more ape-like than man, and they often describe them as gigantic in stature, things like that. And so it kind of does imply that they aren't just your average man. I mean, there's some cases such as the Tennessee wild man, where the description of that creature does seem more man-like. He described it having a long beard, and it made a whooping sound, and it would chase women near these small towns. So you're kind of like, I don't know, that sounds like a lonely trapper who's come down, and there's a thin line there, but I'd say the majority of them truly do describe something that is typically, larger than a man. It has abilities to climb and move and things like that that a person wouldn't have. And if you kind of put all that together, it kind of puts it more in the category of Bigfoot, I think, than just man gone wild.
Right. And do we find kind of that same dispersion that we find stories like that kind of all over the country also?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've got those newspaper clippings from virtually, majority of the states, with some states, of course, having more than others. But you would be really surprised at how many there are of those that have been documented in all kinds of states throughout the U.S.
Well, and I think, as we keep moving further back in time, the communication between people, or why someone would report something so weird, just for the fame and fortune. I think, I don't think people were that way. It's not like today where, everyone wants their 15 minutes of fame. But what about like in Native American tradition? I mean, we know the word Sasquatch, it's a Native American word, but are there a lot of, isn't it?
More or less, it was sort of a conglomeration of terms that was coined, but essentially, yes, it's.
Well, explain. I mean, because I think everyone thinks that, or I thought that. So if that's not the case, then where did that word come from?
Actually, in early writings in the Pacific Coast area, they needed a term for this, and that sounded a little more, better than wild man, I would say. And there is such a history of Native American terms that describe these hairy wild men that the word Sasquatch was coined to represent an average of basically that term. So it wasn't one tribe used Sasquatch. It was that this was, a European writer that coined the phrase. But to answer the question, yeah, there is plenty of documented uses of this term by Native Americans of tribes all over, and specifically in my case, in beyond Boggy Creek, where I'm concentrating on the deep south or the southern Bigfoot. I can find that the Caddo Indians, the Alabama Coshada, the Seminoles, each one of these that you look at, the tribes that inhabited these areas, all had terms for some sort of being of sorts that, you know, lived in the forest and would be described as a forest giant or a hairy man or a things like that. That, of course, again, we've got we kind of have to interpret that as that's a possible Bigfoot. And the trick there is, you know, the Native Americans often had mythological creatures that symbolized nature itself, and, you know, to try to differentiate between what they believed was a flesh and blood creature and what they had created as a mythological creature in their storytelling. But most research, you know, points to the fact that these terms were for creatures that they believed were flesh and blood, things that they believed lived in and among the woods and the areas where they lived, and they lived with them. So, you know, it's again creates a track record for the existence of these creatures, because, of course, if they have existed and do exist and have lived in these areas all along, then certainly the Native Americans would have seen them and known what they were, and possibly seen them more than we see them today. So, you know, it all adds up to build the case.
I'm just going to follow this track because you know how I am with my ancient stuff. So, are there any stories that come out of the Native American culture about their interaction? I mean, there's, you know, them obviously describing them and seeing them, but are there any stories that might even be comparable to stories we have today of a modern Bigfoot sighting or an interaction with a Bigfoot?
I mean, they don't compare so much to the same sighting reports as we get now, where a person, you know, makes an account. I ran into this creature, and, you know, it was, here's the description and here's what it did. These are more woven into the stories that have come down word of mouth and documented, luckily, by guys who saw the benefit in documenting all of the stories from these Native Americans, because there was no written accounts. You can't refer to anything that wasn't already told as a story and then written down later. So what it would be more or less is a creature that they have a word for, and they would have some amount of information as to what that creature was and what it did, more generally than say, you know, my brother saw it and here's what it did. It's more like they have a creature, they have a word for hairy man, you know, honka or whatever they used, and this is a creature that lives among them, lives in the woods. It's either, sometimes it was feared, sometimes it was coexisted peacefully with them, and that was about all it was. There was no real sighting report like we get now. It's just more or less a figure that, by its description and often where it lived and things like that, that we can only assume it may have been a Bigfoot.
Well, and it also sounds like, kind of like today, there wasn't really interaction with them even back then. You know, that they were pretty much isolated and stayed to themselves, which is
Right.
interesting.
Yeah, all of these entities seem like they were on the fringe. You know, they were to be respected. They lived in the woods. I mean, you do get accounts somewhat in the Pacific Northwest that these creatures would kidnap women, things like that. And of course, you know, they were more feared in that regard. And, you know, you do have cases where, excuse me, stories such as in Oklahoma, where there was this Bigfoot human war of some sort, which is part of the legends.
One of the things that you hear stories about from from early culture in America are the stories of the giants. Like Hugh Newman has, wrote a book about the giants and talks about these giants in America. Do you think that there were giants and Sasquatch, or do you think perhaps these stories of giants might have been actually the Sasquatch?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. And while I'm not an expert necessarily on the giants, and I know there's been skeletons found and things like that, and people have analyzed these to determine if they're what amount of human they are they humans, are they something else. So that's where a lot of this intersects, and we just don't have enough written accounts or data to really be able to determine. But of course, when you're talking about giants and large human-like creatures living among the natives at the time, sure, I mean, you kind of just assume that it could be a Bigfoot. Now, whether that is a race of large humans, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, typically humans have gotten larger over time, taller over time, rather than a race of giants. And we do have evidence that there were, like Gigantopithecus, an ape creature that lived in Asia, and it was appeared to be large, and possibly if it walked upright, I mean, this would certainly account for any sort of giants if it had come across into North America. So I tend to think that Bigfoot would be the giant, and humans are humans. But again, it's just really hard to say without more concrete evidence of this.
Mm-hmm. It was just one of those weird thoughts that were going through my head, so I figured I would ask. Um, so in the South, in particular, I don't know what about the Northwest because, like, I just know you guys, from Texas. So, but there are so many stories of Bigfoot or the wild men stories, but they all seem to have different kinds of names, swamp monster, folk monster, this monster, this monster. So are we talking about the same creature? And if you want to kind of share some of the names also that have been given in the South of the Bigfoot-esque thing.
Right. Yeah, certainly that's one of the things that interests me about these cases. As they're told in regional areas, the people would give them regional names. And I think, by all accounts, this is mostly one type of creature. It could be that it's a variation of the species, or as it adapted to its environment because it lives in the southern U.S. as opposed to the mountainous region of the Pacific Northwest. I mean, two different environments. So obviously, over the years, some adaptation could take place. But roughly, I mean, I think it would be the same creature. They're all described in generally the same way, 6, 7 feet tall, covered in hair. The colors vary. You don't find that just one particular state has a red colored one and another state has a black colored one. It's just all over. I mean, almost like humans. I mean, we all have different hair colors and things, and you find the same thing, and it's distributed all throughout the South. Now, as in my first book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, I wrote about the Fouke monster, which is a creature made famous by the Legend of Boggy Creek movie. Now, the Fouke monster, people often ask, do you think it's a Bigfoot? Now, I certainly do, a southern Bigfoot, if you want to be specific. But you have a lot of these similar stories and names, such as the Lake Worth monster, one of the more famous ones in Texas, a case from 1969. One I like, the Sabine thing. That's a name I like. It's a creature roughly along the Sabine River between Louisiana and Texas. You have the Happy Valley Horror. That was one from Florida. just things that the newspaper or media would often refer to as the creature, which kind of regionalized it. But again, you're still describing a Bigfoot, but the names go on, and you have some general terms like woolly booger and wood booger and wood ape and things like this that are kind of used all over. Skunk ape, even while that's primarily associated with Florida, skunk ape can be used all throughout the South. You have a lot of swampy areas. So you have some that sort of transcend state lines and are used generally, and then you have the more specific ones, the Fouke monster, and he lives near Fouke, Arkansas. In my book, I've rounded up an extensive list of these regional names for these creatures, which is that's a fun read right there, just to look at the creative names often used, the Barden booger and Chambers Creek monster, just the many variations that have been used for these creatures. Honey Island swamp monster, of course, is one of the more famous as well.
Well, I guess it sold newspapers.
Yeah, it's like any type of thing, serial killer, they would give them a name, they're all humans and they're crazy humans, but nonetheless, each newspaper would be wanting to coin a sensational term for it. And it's the same thing here, even though it's the same type of creature, they want to, get their regional spin on it. And it did make it more interesting, I think, when you read about it in the paper, if it was referred to, as the Happy Valley Horror has been seen again, the Hollow Paw Gorilla, the Fair Villa Gorilla was one that I really liked as well.
Sounds kind of like Magilla Gorilla. But
yeah, it's
a little bit earlier you were talking about, that there might potentially be different species, which makes me, my little brain go, well, are there thoughts, because I know that you don't have anything concrete, but are there thoughts that there might be more of a water-dwelling swamp type creature versus ones that would live in the mountains, either in the South or the Pacific Northwest? So even though they're all Bigfoots, Big Fi, they're actually a bit different.
The biggest noticeable difference in debate about that would really be in the realm of the skunk ape, the creature seen mostly in Florida. In that case, some of the consensus is those creatures are more ape-like than other types of more upright bipedal Bigfoot. Now, the thing is, when I'm looking at those cases, looking at the reports, again, they're all over the map. Some people say they see it walking upright and it's 7 feet tall. Others see it walking on all fours, at least for a period of time, and maybe the creature is smaller, maybe 5 feet in estimated height. And, there's often different types of prints. You've got 3 toes, 4 toes, 5 toes. And of course, 5 toe would be generally associated with traditional Bigfoot prints. And in the South, you start to see these more bizarre 3-toed and even 4-toed prints, and even more ape-like prints as well that have more of a primate sort of an imprint with the offset toe. And so these are all things that really just muddy the water because, again, it doesn't fall into a very neat separation. Like, if all that was happening in one state, in Florida, and every description said that, it was 5 feet tall and it walked on all fours, you could easily say, yeah, that's got to be something different than Bigfoot. But you'll find that in western Louisiana, for example, there's a lot of swampy areas there, and in the book I talk about this place called Monster Central, and the creatures they see there, many of them, the prints are 3-toed. They've been seen to walk on all fours. many of the sighting occasions. So to me, that also seems very ape-like, like you would think of the skunk ape. So at this point, it's hard to say, but that would be the only difference between traditional Bigfoot and a possible variation in species that exists in the South.
And I don't mean to laugh, but you're talking about, these three-toed thing in Louisiana. And, so of course, like Deliverance comes to mind. And maybe it's like too much inbreeding. And now we have these inbred Bigfoot thing
Well,
going on.
yeah, I mean, yes, it is kind of coincidentally funny that you're talking about the South and you're talking about inbreeding, and that's where we see a lot of these three-toed tracks. And certainly, conceivably, these things would have a very low population, and inbreeding is certainly very possible. So that might account for the three-toed tracks. Um, in some cases, the three-toed tracks I've seen, they don't look so much like deformities, and they don't even look like they would be something that would carry a 7-foot upright animal of that weight. So the jury's really out on those three toes, but certainly the theories would be it's an adaptation, it's inbreeding, things like that that could account for why we see these. But you see them as well. I mean, there's documented cases in Pennsylvania, for example, where there's been some three-toed Bigfoot tracks found. So it's never very consistent, which creates even more difficulty in trying to categorize or make sense of the data.
But when you find a three-toed track, it's still clearly identifiable as being a Bigfoot track versus some other animal, or what you're putting into that Bigfoot category.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to rule out. It's not a human with three toes, and it's not some other kind of animal, even a large animal like a bear or anything like that. These are definitely bizarre tracks, and really have to fall into the Bigfoot category, unknown primate, unknown hominid, or something, because that's really the only explanation there are for those. They're certainly not, easily you can tell they're not human or anything like that.
Are they a fairly recent development on the scene, or have people been finding three-toed tracks, since they've started researching Bigfoot, I'm going to say in the last 50 years?
Yeah, they date back. I mean, one of the most famous three-toed track stories came from the Falcon Monster case, and that those tracks were found in 1971, and that's almost one reason where people often say, "Oh, Southern Bigfoot, they have three toes." Well, the Legend of Boggy Creek was so widely dispersed, and so many people saw it. And there was a section in the movie that talked about these three-toed tracks that were found, and it was a very clear trackway. There was no mistake. It wasn't just one or two tracks. These went for 100 yards, and so that that dates it back to 1971, and then that kind of permeated all through Southern Bigfoot lore. So that's where that comes from. But yeah, certainly it's not anything new, and something that's been found kind of as far back as we really started documenting this stuff as in terms of Bigfoot.
That's Lyle Blackburn. His book is Beyond Boggy Creek. His webpage is lyleblackburn.com. And thank you for watching this portion of our interview with Lyle. If you've been enjoying today's program, please click on the button below and subscribe to our channel. If you want to hear this interview in its entirety, become a Just Energy Radio insider at justenergyradio.com and access full shows commercial free and gain access to our over 10 years of show archives. Don't forget to share this episode with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So until next time, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy. Be blessed.